Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window. A second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky. Mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees. Watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, it opens. Peppa Pig. The stranger. A new resident had come to town. No one knew where he came from. He simply appeared. A tall, white wolf with a long snout and a calm, too straight stare. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He only nodded when someone greeted him. Mummy Pig said he had bought the house on the edge of town. "He doesn't have anyone," she added. "Probably just wants peace and quiet." Daddy Pig nodded, but he seemed uneasy ever since. Peppa first saw the wolf near the shop. He stood still by the window, not looking at the products, but at his own reflection. She waved. He slowly turned his head and nodded. Slowly. His eyes didn't blink. After that, she started noticing him more often. At the bus stop, even though no buses came there. On the forest path. Sometimes walking down the street, but with no sound of footsteps. Then the nights began. The first night, Peppa woke up suddenly. She didn't know why. Just opened her eyes and looked at the wall. Everything was silent, but the room felt occupied. George was asleep beside her. The door was shut, the window dark. She thought it was just a dream. The second night, she woke again. A cold feeling washed over her. At first, silence. Then, breathing. Very soft, like someone was behind her. Peppa froze, turned. No one there. But in the morning, she noticed, the curtains were slightly open, even though Mummy always shut them tight. On the third night, she saw him. He stood in the corner of her room, the white wolf, tall. The moon's shadow passed through him, but his outline was clear. Eyes, black, lifeless. He didn't move, just stared, silently. Peppa screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in, but the room was empty. Mummy said, "It was just a dream." Daddy hugged her tightly, but his face was pale. He understood something, but said nothing. Peppa no longer slept alone, but that didn't help. On the fourth night, George woke her. He stood by the window, pointing outside. There, in the edge of the fog, near the street lamp, stood the wolf. His face couldn't be seen, just the silhouette, motionless. Peppa gripped George's hoof. From that night on, he came every night, and each night felt longer. Daddy Pig began locking the doors. Mummy shut every window. They stopped talking about it, just glanced over their shoulders. On the sixth night, Peppa woke and realized she couldn't move. George was asleep. The nightlight flickered, and in the doorway stood a figure, white, tall. He tilted his head. Slowly, he whispered, but there were no words, only sound, like the wind whispering through ears. Peppa woke up in tears, but the footprints on the floor remained. On the seventh day, Daddy was gone. He had gone out for bread and never returned. On the kitchen table lay a note. He didn't leave. He's just with him now. Peppa didn't know who wrote it. Mummy just held her close. Since that night, they never turn off the lights. But someday, it'll turn on in her room anyway, and Peppa knows he won't leave until he takes someone else. Peppa Pig, the box of drawings. It started on a quiet morning. Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was dragging something along the floor. In the hallway, she saw him carrying a cardboard box. Old, dusty, no writing on it. It looked like something forgotten in a basement. "Where did you get that?" Peppa asked. George didn't answer. He just smiled. He placed the box on the floor and opened it. Inside were drawings, dozens, some on torn scraps of paper, others fresh and colorful, all drawn by a child's hoof. "Did you draw these?" George stayed silent. The first drawing was simple. Peppa standing in the kitchen, a broken cup on the floor, Daddy with a broom, Mummy holding a rag. A few hours later, it happened, exactly like in the drawing, down to the smallest detail. Peppa dropped a cup, shards scattered. Daddy sighed. Mummy got the rag. "Just a coincidence," Mummy said. But George pulled out the next drawing. It showed their garden, a ball stuck in the tree, Daddy holding a ladder, Peppa reaching up. The next day, the ball really did get stuck in the same place, exactly like the drawing. Peppa started going through the drawings. The further she went, the darker they became. The colors, duller. The figures, twisted. One showed Peppa's room at night. At the window, a silhouette. Faceless. Peppa shoved it to the bottom of the box. But that night she woke up, went to the window. For a moment, she thought someone had just stepped out of view. Another drawing, the bathroom, the mirror, Peppa's reflection smiling, even though she wasn't. Another one, George sleeping, and beside his bed stood a second George, identical, but with red crayon eyes. Peppa hid the box in the closet, but George found it again. He said, "I have to keep watching." Every day, new drawings appeared, even though no one was drawing. One morning, at the very top of the pile, was a picture of that exact breakfast. The tablecloth, the cup, the toast, all correct. At the edge, a drop. Peppa thought it was paint, but it was tea. Then came a drawing of the living room. Daddy asleep in his chair, and behind him, someone reaching toward his shoulder. That evening, Daddy flinched. He said, "I thought someone touched me," but the room was empty. At last, Peppa found the final drawing. It was black and white. It showed herself, standing alone in an empty room. No windows, no toys. Her face, blank, arms limp at her sides, and behind her, the box, and written in neat handwriting, "Now you're inside." That night, Peppa woke up. The room felt unusually dark, too quiet. On the floor, the box, empty. All the drawings were gone. Only one remained. It lay on top. It showed Mummy, Daddy, and George sitting at the table, smiling, laughing. But Peppa wasn't there, and at the bottom, written carefully, "They don't remember you anymore." Peppa Pig. The glass. One morning, Peppa went into the bathroom to brush her teeth. It was early and foggy, the light outside pale and grey. The bathroom lamp was on but dim, as if shining through mist. The mirror was fogged around the edges, but in the center, there was a perfect clean circle, as if someone had wiped it from the inside. Peppa froze. She touched the glass with her hoof. The circle didn't smear. She looked at her reflection. It was her. But something was wrong. Her hand moved with a slight delay. The blinking was out of sync. The smile looked forced. A small, almost invisible misaligned version of herself. She stepped out without saying anything. But from that morning on, she never stayed long in the bathroom. She avoided looking in the mirror for more than a second. On the third day, she saw a crack, thin as a hair, running from the bottom corner toward the top, barely visible unless you knew it was there. She ran to get Mummy, but when they came back, the mirror was perfect again. No crack, no fog, no circle. "Must have been the steam," said Mummy. "Don't worry, sweetheart." Peppa didn't answer. The next morning, the crack was back, deeper, sharper, and the reflection was more off. Peppa twitched her ear. The reflection hesitated. She raised a brow. It copied her, but not quite right. The eyes in the mirror were emptier. That evening, Peppa returned alone. She stared into the mirror, long, still. Then she noticed the reflection shimmered, as if the glass were water and something behind it was moving. The next day, there was writing on the mirror, drawn with a fingertip from the inside. "Hello." Peppa wiped it off with shaking hooves, sat alone in her room, tried to forget. But the next morning, another word, "Let me in," then, "I'm almost out." Each morning, new phrases, each day, more cracks. Peppa hung a towel over the mirror, tried not to look at it at all, but she felt it, watching her, through fabric, through walls, through dreams. One night, she woke up. The bathroom door creaked open slowly. There was no light inside, but from within came a sound, fingers scratching glass, steady, deliberate, like someone was writing. Peppa walked to the doorway, turned on the light. The mirror read, "Now you're inside." And the cracks had formed a web. Her reflection no longer mimicked her. It just stood there, head slightly tilted, mouth half open, eyes blank, and then it smiled. Peppa screamed, ran, locked herself in her room. That night, the mirror shattered with a soft, delicate sound. In the morning, there was no sign of it, only cold air, and a thin layer of dust on the floor in the shape of tiny hoof prints. When Mummy Pig came into the bathroom, the mirror was new, no cracks, no words, spotless. But when she looked into it, the reflection blinked first, and for a split second, just behind her shoulder, appeared a second Peppa face, slightly distorted, with a stretched grin and wide, unblinking eyes.
Peppa Pig The Mask. It began on a cold, windy day, the kind of wind that pulled at trees and scattered wet leaves across the pavement. The sky had been grey for many days, the park was empty, and the paths were soggy. Peppa and George were walking along a muddy path. Leaves stuck to their boots, and the ground squelched beneath them. Then Peppa saw a white shape lying in the grass. A mask. It lay perfectly flat, as if placed there on purpose. Not fallen, not forgotten. Face up, white, smooth, featureless. Just two dark slits for eyes, and a thin line where a mouth should be, not a smile. Peppa stopped. She bent down, touched it with her hoof. The mask was dry, not cold, as if it had been waiting for her. She pressed it to her face. The mask stuck, silently, effortlessly. At first it seemed like a game, but the mask wouldn't come off. Her hooves slid along the surface, finding no edge, no straps, no seams, nothing. She tugged, pulled harder. It didn't move. The mask had become part of her face. When they returned home, no one reacted, or maybe no one wanted to. The family acted as though nothing had changed, too calm, too quiet. Peppa sat at the dinner table, but her voice sounded muffled, like it was coming through glass. No one looked directly at her. The next day, the mirror behaved oddly. When Peppa turned her head, the reflection lagged behind. When she raised her hoof, the motion was off, as if someone inside the mirror was trying to mimic her but not quite managing. By the third day, she could barely feel her face. The mask didn't press, didn't itch. It simply was, still, silent. She tried to remember her old appearance, but the image blurred, like looking through foggy water. Her toys felt unfamiliar. The room looked wrong. Even her favorite blanket smelled different. Her clothes didn't fit right. Everything rubbed, tugged, shifted. She no longer felt at home in her own home. Time passed strangely, day after day, but it meant nothing. The house grew quieter, as if it were absorbing sound. Mummy and Daddy rarely spoke. They were present but distant and fading. Peppa began to hear whispering, not from outside, from within. A whisper without breath, without tone, repeating again and again, "You are the mask. You are me. You were." On the fourth day, the photographs changed. Faces faded. First George, then Daddy, then Peppa herself. The places where eyes and smiles used to be became pale, empty spots. Sometimes the mask itself changed, subtly, narrower, smoother, as if it was adjusting. Each time she looked in the mirror, she saw something unfamiliar, something staring back at her from the shadows, always silent. On the fifth day, the room had changed. No windows, walls blank like paper. The air was heavy, like she'd slept for too long. She woke up and didn't recognize anything. Nothing felt familiar, no toys, no books, no sound. In the middle of the floor lay the mask, dry, clean, and no longer on her. She couldn't remember who she was, didn't know why she stood up, didn't feel her own face. In the mirror across the room stood something that resembled Peppa, but the eyes were hollow, and inside them, silence. Peppa was gone. Only the shell remained, only the mask remained, waiting for a new face, a new game. Since then, some days, along the damp paths near the park, the mask can be seen again, lying neatly, dry, clean, and if anyone picks it up, they may hear a soft whisper from within, "I was